Hi, it's Dr. Lori, the Ph.D. Antiques Appraiser, and I'm here with some amazing treasures that I found at my events for years and years. Over the years, of course, you know that I have found lots of objects. People bring me their art, their antiques, their collectibles, and I appraise them on the spot. So, these amazing treasures. This first one, of course, is a great story, and you can see how happy I was to meet these guys. These guys are cousins. So I was in Minnesota, and that's where the event took place. And these guys drove from Iowa to Minnesota all to meet. So they live in different places, and they all came to Minnesota in order to have me appraise these objects and also to help clean out their deceased grandmother's storage unit. So this was interesting. So they come together, and I'm doing a couple of shows that day. I did an 11 o'clock show and I did a 3 o'clock show. So the guys show up at the 3 o'clock show and they kind of look a little tired. And I said, well, how are you doing? He said, well, you know, we were kind of up late last night. And we were you haven't seen each other in a long time. You know, threw a couple back, had some fun, stayed up late. And so we decided to come to the afternoon show for you, Dr. Lori. And I said, well, it's good to see you either way. Tell me what you brought. I said, well, we brought these little black pots, these little black pottery pieces that Grandma had left for us. And she left them for us in the storage unit. And we had to go to the storage unit. And then there were names on these boxes. And each one of us got a box. And in the box was this pot. I said, wow. I said, well, that's pretty cool. And I said, are you all different ages? They were all about the same, ages. They're close in age. So they seemed to be good guys, that they were kind of happy to be together and to have the pots and to help out with trying to clean out this for Grandma. And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, well, we really kind of like the pots, but we don't know what they are. I said, well, I know what they are. I said, they're Maria Martinez Native American pots. What else did your grandmother collect? They said, well, she collected a lot of Southwestern Native American stuff, jewelry and pottery and such. They're blackware pots, and they're pretty characteristic of the work of Maria Martinez, very, very famous Pueblo potter, who was active from the early years of the 1900s until her death in the 1980s. And she also had a husband who she was married to until he died in 1943, named Julian. And these pots were signed. They were signed Maria Martinez in the characteristic blackware style of the artist. And each one had one, and they were very valuable. At the time, the 3 pots together were worth $10,000, and the cousins were happy because each pot was worth about the same amount, about $3,500 per pot. So it was a nice way to sort of have a weekend together to meet me. I was happy to meet them, and also, of course, to honor Grandma and her collections. It was an amazing treasure that came to one of my events. This next story of one of my events took place in Kentucky, and I will really never forget this one. I've seen so many people, met so many people, and many of you I think I'll never forget, but I won't forget this. So I'm on the stage, I'm doing my event, I'm talking about different things. There is a rooster Weathervane up on the stage near me, and we have all the objects come up on the table if you've never seen one of my events. And there's large crowds, and it's a lot of fun, and I tell them the history and the background and, of course, a value. So this gentleman's in the front. He's kind of a big guy, kind of football player type, and he's sitting in the front, young guy. And I start to talk about the Weathervane that he has. And I say, it's a beautiful Weathervane, and it's this. And at the time, the Weathervane market is doing great, and people are interested in Weathervanes and collecting them, 19th century Weathervanes. And I always say, how did you acquire the piece? So he says, well, Dr. Lori, I acquired the piece, and I got it off the cupola of the barn of the family homestead, the family farm. So I said, oh, well, that's interesting. And I said, so is this your particular farm? He said, it's been my family's farm for a long, long time. So I look back at the Weathervane. I start to talk about the way in which the Weathervane's constructed and the materials of the Weathervane. And I look back up at him, and he's starting to get teary-eyed. And I said, well, tell me, and I won't use his name, but tell me your name. And I said, tell me, what's the matter? And he said, Dr. Lori, he said, I'm supporting everybody. He said, I've got kids. He goes, my parents are living with us now because the barn and the farm that this Weathervane came off of is in foreclosure. And I don't know what I'm going to do. So I said, oh my gosh, you don't know what you're going to do. And I said, no. He said, I don't know what you're going to do. I said, well, maybe you want to think about selling the Weathervane because at the time it's worth $15,000. And he starts crying harder. And you know, when you see grown men cry, you're kind of like, oh gosh, you know, he was so happy. He was so grateful. He was so excited because this really might change his life. So I was really happy to be part of it, to be able to tell him what the value of the Weathervane was in that particular market. What do you look for? You look for these figures that are unusual. You look for these figures in good condition, particularly with Weathervanes. And then there's different materials that mean something with Weathervanes. You have some that are old that are just cut out of one piece of metal, flat metal. But then you have the others that are constructed that are in fact three-dimensional. And then his was actually conserved some, but he said, I'm so happy that I took it off the barn. He said, if that Weathervane went with, of course, the rest of it in foreclosure, I would have lost that and the Weathervane, the farm and the Weathervane. So he was really happy. It was an amazing treasure and one of the stories I really won't forget. This next amazing treasure from one of my events happened in Virginia. And this particular piece is a great example. I recognized this piece very, very quickly. And of course, the owner knew the artist as well. I actually recognized this piece as a work by Walter Emerson Baum, who is a Pennsylvania Impressionist artist of the early years of the 20th century. And I had written exhibitions about Baum and also curated exhibitions about Baum and had been involved with many of the great Walter Baum pieces, paintings in fact. And he was an art teacher as well as a founder of a museum in northeastern Pennsylvania and such. So Baum is very, very well known. This piece, actually, I said to the owner here, she said, well, you know, Dr. Lori, I've been waiting for your show. And as I said, you know, my shows usually have a morning show and an afternoon show at most of these big events. And she said, well, I was here with my sister. I said, oh, okay, well, tell me about that. She said, well, I was here with my sister. My sister had to leave. So she said, I have to leave and I want to get my painting appraised. And I said, well, I'll get your painting appraised, but I want the painting. So she basically said, I'll get it appraised for you, but I want it. So she said, well, that's fine. I didn't really like that painting anyway, and Mom gave it to me, but you can have it. Then you have it appraised, but I've got to go because I've waited a long time. And now I, in fact, can't wait any longer. I've enjoyed Dr. Lori's show, but I've got another appointment. Okay, so the sister waits, she sends the piece comes up onto my stage and I look at it and I said, oh, well, it's Walter Baum. She said, I know. She said, Walter Baum actually painted this particular painting of a home that we owned near his home in Pennsylvania. She said, so we knew Walter Baum and this particular image, this building in this home, in this painting is the building that my family owned for a long time. So kind of like the rooster, it was something that was ownership within the family for a long, long time. So she says to me, well, Dr. Lori, I don't have any idea what this could be worth. And now it's been in the family a long time. And we love it because, of course, it's my grandparents' home, and they also ran a small store out of it. And it's from Pennsylvania. My family was from Pennsylvania, but now my sister gave it to me. And you know what? I want to know what it's worth. What's it worth? $40,000. At the time, it was a real amazing treasure and still is. And what's wonderful about that too is that she actually would go and visit the site where that home was when she would go and visit her extended family up north. So, terrific piece. Speaking of north and maybe south, this next amazing treasure comes from one of my events, and this one is a Civil War quilt. This piece was a piece that was handed down in the family, and this gentleman, the owner, could actually trace it back to the person in his family. Couple things you want to look for is I want you to look for when you're looking at patchwork quilts of any time period, of any type, as I want you to look for size. I want you to look for the quality and the printed material. Some of the fabrics actually are printed and you'll think, oh, that must be a new fabric, when in fact, the fabrics that are printed can be quite old. So don't think just because it's a print fabric that it is in fact a new fabric. That's not always the case. This one is a Civil War quilt, and what's wonderful about it is it really tells the story of the Civil War, and specifically it told the story of a member of this gentleman's family. So if you look at the quilt, you're going to notice there's a lot of ink writing on it, phrases, poems, little rhyme schemes on it. And those particular little rhymes and phrases actually speak to the way in which these quilts were a really big part of the Civil War and the experience of the soldiers during the Civil War. Many soldiers would go to war with a quilt taken from home. And the idea of these quilts was, of course, for bedding. So you would have something when you were, of course, going from battle to battle, when you had something that you could be warm and keep yourself warm in. These quilts often became, unfortunately, during these battles, sometimes the dead would be, of course, wrapped in these quilts. The wounded were almost always wrapped with their quilts. So a quilt like this one actually went from the battlefield with a wounded soldier to a hospital, a Civil War hospital, where the wounded would go. And during that time is when the writing took place, when all of these phrases about it was a Union soldier and a Union quilt, and we could document that from, of course, the owner, but all these phrases about Jefferson Davis and trying to beat Jefferson Davis and such. A lot of information on the quilt itself. That's what impacts the value, because that's how it relates to history. And any time the pieces relate to history, you're going to see the value go up. This piece was able to be connected to history, as well as it told you whether or not you had a Confederate or a Union soldier using this particular quilt. And it also had a great craftsmanship in the quilt making process too. So you're seeing the patchwork is beautiful as well. It was in very good condition, but in fact, this particular piece had a value that really the owner didn't really care one way or another. I told him it was worth $10,000 and he said, it's not going anywhere, it's staying in the family. This next amazing treasure is from the west coast of the United States, and this particular one has a great story about the history, again, of World War II. This piece is a French watercolor by a very famous artist named Eugène Boudin. Now, you may not know Eugène Boudin, but you probably know one of his most famous students. His famous student was Claude Monet, the French Impressionist. And this particular piece is a watercolor. It's a watercolor of a famous beach. Do you like the beach? I'm not big on the sand. I don't like the sand, but I like to just lay on the beach and watch everybody walk around. I like the water, but the sand part I'm not crazy about. But in the 19th century, the French Impressionists was oftentimes capture, of course, beach scenes. This particular beach is called Trouville, and Trouville is a very, very famous, it's spelled like Trouville, V-I-L-L-E, but the beach scenes are very, very popular in this idea of trying to capture the time when you went on vacation or you took a day off in the late 19th century. The late 19th century, the Impressionist works of art are characterized by quick brushstrokes, thick application of paint. With watercolor, it's quick brush strokes, and you can see lots of different colors coming in. This is a beautiful example of that quick application of the pigment and also of the beach. You'll notice how the scene is in fact characterizing sort of the costumes of the beach dwellers. The people who are going to the beach and who has a hat and who's wearing sort of a swimsuit, who's wearing a big skirt and sitting on a chair. But the beach at Trouville was a very, very famous image and a famous place for all of the Impressionists. This piece came to the owner who I met at one of my big events. She said, my grandfather got this piece in payment in Hong Kong, in payment for, in fact, foodstuffs at the store that he ran. He ran a store in Hong Kong. A person came in during World War II, didn't have enough money, and said, will you take the watercolor instead in payment for the things that I need, for the food that I need? And her grandfather said, sure, I'll take that. So he took the watercolor, gave them the food, and the piece has been handed down in the family ever since. Value on the piece, $17,000. It was an amazing treasure and also a family heirloom. This next piece was really fun. This was a small event, and I remember very clearly it was a small private event, and it was for clients of a particular business, and they wanted to have their pastor involved. So they asked their pastor if he would come and if he could bring something. And I remember the pastor was a nice guy, and he said, Dr. Laurie, I'm going to bring this flute. You know, this is a fife, basically. It was a civil Revolutionary War era fife. And he said, and I'm going to bring this Bible. And he said, the Bible is actually from the church where I'm the pastor, and it's been in the church for a long time. And I said, well, let me take a look at it. So I take a look at it and you can see it's of German origin, and you can see this particular piece is in very nice condition. So I said, well, how is your Roman numerals? How are your Roman numerals? I'm pretty good with the Roman numerals. I like them. It's hard, but I like to kind of do the math backwards and subtract, and you know how that works. So anyway, I do the Roman numerals, and I hope I get this right. It's from 1670. This particular book, this Bible, is from 1670. Do you notice the two-tone color? If you notice the two-tone color of the printing, that's oftentimes a very big tip when you're looking at Bibles and other books, historic and of course antique books that have that two-tone. Usually it's red and black in terms of the inks. It will basically allow, the red will allow, of course, something to pop. With Bibles, because a lot of time was taken with the presentation and making of Bibles, you're going to see that red and black is oftentimes utilized. This particular Bible from 1670 was a lovely example in beautiful condition. Why is it in beautiful condition? It's in beautiful condition because it was maintained by the church. You know, when things get traded here, there, and everywhere, then what tends to happen is condition gets, of course, by the wayside. People tend to not be so careful with the piece, and they tend to not use it and not to take care of it as well. But when it maintains in the same place, in the same family, in the same church, usually in good condition. The pastor was floored when I told him that the 1670 era Bible is worth $4,000. A really wonderful, amazing treasure. He was pretty amazing too. He's an interesting guy, and he was really happy to be able to bring that piece back to his congregation and tell them a little bit more about its history. This next amazing treasure was from an event as well, and as you know, some of the great American painters were trained at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Some of them were trained in a manner that, of course, would allow them to paint some of the great figureheads of the colonial period, for example. People like Gilbert Stuart, who of course painted George Washington, and other people like Benjamin Franklin, who was painted, or Thomas Jefferson, who was painted. And this particular piece is a portrait. It's a portrait that came in that was in the owner's family, and this particular portrait was one where he wanted a little bit more information. He knew it was painted by an artist named Thomas Sully, who was affiliated, of course, with the great Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, the oldest art school in the United States. And it is an art school that is recognized for its importance in realism. And this particular idea was that realism is, again, that notion of realism is the way in which these pieces were made. So to have a realistic piece was really seen as, you know, a cut above all the rest of the artists. This particular piece is a beautiful example, a wonderful portrait and characteristic of Thomas Sully's style. Painted in the latter part of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Value on it? It's a kicker. $50,000 for this beautiful portrait by Thomas Sully. There's also Thomas Sully paintings in major museums and even in the governor's mansion in Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania too. There's lots of amazing treasures out there, and I'm happy to show you some of the ones that I've been able to appraise over the years. I'm Dr. Lori. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.